Hello, I'm Catherine Steele. I'm Professor of Classics at the University of Glasgow, and welcome to this short series of lectures designed to fit with the classical civilization A-level topic, Politics in the Late Republic, and I will be looking particularly at the Cicero bit of the prescription for that option. So what I want to do in these lectures is to look both at the speeches and the letters, and I'm going to start with the speeches. And what I'm going to think about first of all is how do we study oratory? Because if you read an ancient speech, whether it's Demosthenes or Lysias or Cicero, they can be quite difficult, I think, to get to grips with and to enjoy in the way that other genres of ancient literature are much more accessible. So Catullus seems to speak to us, and perhaps oratory doesn't. So it can be a difficult genre to get to grips with, and there are some things that I think help, just in general, to make this a more accessible and understandable and interesting and important type of writing to get to grips with. And it is important because one of the things we have to remember is that for members of the elite throughout classical antiquity, oratory was the genre that they themselves would expect to have to practice in the course of their public lives. They might write poetry, perhaps. They might enjoy hearing other people perform poetry or dramatic performances. They might enjoy reading philosophy. They might even consider themselves to be philosophers. But it's oratory, public speech, that members of the elite need to be able to do. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why it makes sense to look at oratory seriously, because this is the genre of writing that shows us the elite in antiquity at work. It mattered in practical ways. The other reason we should take oratory seriously is that some of the surviving texts of oratory from antiquity are magnificent works of art once one understands what it is they're trying to achieve and how they achieve that. And Cicero is a wonderful example of that, because his speeches are magnificent examples of oratory and were regarded as such. One of the reasons why Cicero was so influential and one of the reasons why his works survive is because people recognised in them masterpieces. So much so, in fact, that Cicero is the only public speaker from the Republican period whose speeches survive in their own independent manuscript tradition. We've got fragments of other speakers that are quoted by later writers, which suggests that some texts did survive at least into the Empire and into late antiquity. But it's only Cicero who makes it through to survive in manuscript tradition after the end of antiquity, to be available then to make the transition into print. So what is it about Cicero that meant that he so dominated the canon of oratory that no one else really got a look in afterwards? So that's another reason why we should at least try to understand what's going on here. So, by way of introduction, let's touch briefly on why public speech matters in antiquity. It matters fundamentally because of the political systems of the city-states of antiquity. And if we think about Rome, focusing in for this course, in the Republican period, public speech matters because, in some sense at least, Republican Rome was a participatory democracy. That is, citizens voted and their votes directed public policy. Now, of course, the challenge in working out the political system of the Republic is how do we balance the role of the citizen body as a whole with the role of the aristocratic elite, the elected magistrates who made up the Senate, because that group of men was not representative of society as a whole. So that's a bigger challenge about thinking about late Republican politics. But because the people vote, public speech matters because it's the chief way in which you can influence people to change their minds about something. Now, the voting that the citizen body engages in can be broadly split, I think, into two categories. We've got votes in elections, choosing magistrates, and we've got votes on legislative proposals. One of the interesting things about the Republic is there doesn't seem to have been electoral oratory as a specific category. There aren't hustings. But within that framework, oratory really matters in terms of creating public reputation that will then transmit into votes at elections. And I'll come back to that in the next lecture when thinking about why Cicero turned to oratory when he started his public career. But in terms of direct changing of minds, where oratory matters in the Republic in relation to the people as a whole, is around legislative proposals, because laws are voted on by the people as a whole, and they vote after they have heard arguments for and against that legislative proposal. And they hear those arguments at things which we call contiones. A contio is a public meeting, and the speeches delivered at contiones were incredibly important in directing public policy. The other way that oratory mattered for members of the elite was within the Senate itself, which was an important deliberative body, set policy in a whole range of areas, particularly influential around foreign policy. And so there was an expectation that men should be able to speak effectively in the Senate as well. It's also the case in Rome that the law courts determined on issues that we might consider to be political, and that very often the defendants in the courts were men in public life who might be accused, for example, of misconduct in provincial government, and we'll see that when we turn to the Verines. There's a charge of maestas, treason. And so oratory within the courts also was a forum where political matters could be discussed and where members of the elite could create advantage for themselves by being able to speak effectively. And we should remember that in Rome, unlike, for example, classical Athens, there is the possibility of advocacy. That is, a defendant is not obliged to speak on his own behalf and can get somebody else to do it for him. Before closing this first lecture on how to study oratory and why we might be interested in doing oratory, let's think a little bit about rhetoric as the formal training and underpinning of public speech. Now, the ability to speak well doesn't depend on training, and we know that the Romans were speaking in public and assessing their performance long before they incorporated ideas about how to speak effectively from Greece. Most of the rhetorical theory we know of at Rome is, at least in origin, an import from the Greek-speaking world. But rhetoric codifies oratory, and it helps us understand what sorts of things public speakers thought were important when they came to write and deliver speeches. There are three basic categories of oratory in the ancient world. There is deliberative oratory, which is, if you like, political oratory. What should we do? There's forensic oratory, the oratory in the law courts. And there's also a category called epideictic oratory, which is, broadly speaking, display oratory. And we don't have very much epideictic oratory as such. Funeral speeches really are the only freestanding type of speech that falls into that category, and we don't actually have any complete funeral speeches surviving. But epideictic elements, particularly invective, are quite prominent in other kinds of oratory. Now, rhetoric becomes an incredibly complicated codified system, huge amounts in it about style and figures of speech. But if we cling on to some kind of simple headings as a way through that jungle, deliberative oratory poses the question, what should we do? And you derive the arguments you need from thinking that the course of action you're proposing is either beneficial or honourable. So it's either the right thing to do or it's a useful, helpful thing to do. Within forensic oratory, a system develops which helps you identify the issue. That is the question you're debating about. And in particular, it can help an orator determine, is the issue one of fact? Did Caelius murder the Egyptian ambassadors? Or a question of law? Does this particular offence fall under this statute? That kind of thing. And in the case of Verres, as we'll see, quite a lot of it is questions of fact. When you open a speech and ask yourself what's going on here, some basic questions, I think, to pose. Who is the orator speaking to? Who's the audience? And what is the outcome of this speech? What is the decision that the speaker is trying to influence? So is it a verdict in a court? Is it a decision that the Senate is going to make? What is it that's at stake here? Of course, as we'll see, what's at stake in a speech doesn't always need to be what's apparently at stake. So there's often a set of ulterior motives or additional factors, and for those we need to understand the context and the background of a speech. But basic questions of who is the orator speaking to and what is he trying to achieve are always helpful starting points.